There's nothing quite like the sting of being the laughingstock of your own hometown. Sir Aldric knew that feeling well as he watched the villagers of Greenhollow point and whisper whenever he passed by in his rusted armor. They called him the Rust Knight behind his back, a landless man with a battered sword and empty pockets. So when word spread that he'd inherited Castle Ravenshollow, the laughter was heard in every tavern. The castle was nothing but a crumbling ruin, its towers burned black and walls covered in ivy. It seemed fitting that their poorest knight would get their most worthless inheritance. But Aldric accepted it with quiet dignity. As he rode toward the abandoned fortress, he hoped to find something more than just broken stone and memories. What he discovered deep beneath the castle would change everything. But would this hidden fortune become his blessing or his downfall? Before we continue, tell us where you're listening from. And if you enjoy this story, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow brings something special. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of Greenhollow like whispered secrets, and Sir Aldric Thornfield moved through it with the measured pace of a man who had learned not to hurry toward disappointment. His boots, worn thin at the heels, clicked against the stones in a rhythm that had become as familiar to the villagers as the church bells. At 34, he carried himself with the bearing of nobility that his bloodline had never quite earned him. Shoulders straight, chin level, eyes forward, even as his patched cloak and dented breastplate told a different story. The village stirred around him as it had re-mourning for the past 3 years since he'd settled here. Neither fully welcome nor entirely unwanted. Merchants opened their shutters with cautious glances in his direction. Children peeked from doorways before being pulled back by mothers who weren't quite sure what to make of a knight without lands, without wealth, without the proper pedigree that should accompany the title. Thomas the baker was sweeping flour from his threshold when Aldric passed, and their eyes met briefly. There was no malice in Thomas's weathered face, but there was something else, a kind of weary sympathy that stung worse than outright scorn. "Morning, Sir Aldric," Thomas said, his voice carrying the careful politeness reserved for those whose status remained unclear. "Good morning, Thomas. The bread smells fine today." "Aye, well, the ovens don't care much for titles, do they?" Thomas's attempt at humor fell flat between them, and both men knew it. Aldric nodded and continued down the street, past the Fletcher who never quite met his eyes, past the seamstress who had once mended his surcoat for half the usual price, a kindness that had felt more like charity. These were good people, decent folk who worked with their hands and raised their children, to be honest. But they were also people who understood their place in the world's order. And Sir Aldric's place remained frustratingly undefined. He had been knighted on the battlefield at Milford Bridge, where his sword had saved the life of Lord Garrett's eldest son. The ceremony had been brief, conducted by torchlight, with blood still fresh on everyone's armor. But battlefield knighthoods, while valid, carried their own particular weight or lack thereof. They spoke of courage, certainly, but also of convenience. They were rewards given in the heat of moment, sometimes regretted in the cold light of peace. The son of Magnus Thornfield, the blacksmith, had always understood that his path would be different. His father had been a good man, respected in his trade, but iron and steel were tools, not heritage. When Magnus had died of the wasting sickness 5 years ago, he'd left his son nothing but strong hands, an understanding of metalwork, and a stubborn pride that had already caused more trouble than it was worth. Aldric's modest dwelling sat at the edge of Greenhollow, close enough to be part of the community, but far enough away to maintain the illusion of status. It was a simple stone cottage with a thatched roof that needed repair, though he'd learned to mend what he could himself. The garden behind it grew herbs and vegetables with the dutiful efficiency of a man who had discovered that nobility meant nothing to empty stomach. Inside the cottage held the sparse possessions of someone caught between worlds. His father's anvil occupied one corner, too heavy to sell, too meaningful to abandon. His knight's sword hung above the fireplace, cleaned and oiled, but showing the nicks and wear of actual use. A small shelf held 3 books, a volume on horsemanship, another on the proper conduct of arms, and a third, his most treasured possession, containing the genealogies and histories of the realm's great houses. It was this last book that had taught him the bitter lesson of his own position. He could trace every major bloodline back 7 generations, could recite the marriages and alliances that had shaped the kingdom, but his own name appeared nowhere in those carefully illuminated pages. The Thornfields were common folk who had earned their surname from their trade, not their deeds. Yet here he was, undeniably a knight. The ceremony had been witnessed by 200 men. The words had been spoken. "Rise, Sir Aldric." The shoulder tap with Lord Garrett's own blade had been real enough. But in the years since, he had discovered that being a knight and being accepted as one were entirely different matters. The gentry tolerated him at formal gatherings, included him in the rituals and ceremonies that required his presence, but their conversations stopped when he approached. Their invitations came late, if at all. Their daughters were steered away from his path with the subtle efficiency of parents who understood that love was a luxury, but marriage was business. The common folk, meanwhile, weren't quite sure what to do with him. He was one of them by birth, but his title created an awkward distance. They couldn't speak to him with the easy familiarity they'd shown Magnus's boy, but neither could they offer him the automatic deference given to those born to nobility. He existed in a space between worlds, belonging fully to neither. It was this isolation that made the letter's arrival such a momentous event. Master Cornelius, the village scribe and the closest thing Greenhollow had to a learned man, had summoned him with unusual formality. The old man's hands had trembled slightly as he'd broken the wax seal, the mark of the crown's own chancery. Sir Aldric Thornfield, Cornelius had read, his voice growing stronger with each formal phrase. By royal decree, and in accordance with the laws of inheritance as established in the reign of King Edmund the Just, you are hereby informed of your inheritance of the estate and holdings of the late Sir Roderick Ravenshollow, your great-uncle by marriage to your grandmother's sister, Lady Meredith of Ashford. The words had hung in the air like incense, heavy and strange. Aldric had never heard of Sir Roderick, had no memory of any connection to the Ravenshollow name. His grandmother had died when he was a child, and if she'd had a sister who'd married into nobility, it was news to him. But there it was, written in the formal script of the royal clerks. Castle Ravenshollow, with all its lands and holdings, was his by right of blood and law. Cornelius had continued reading, his voice growing more puzzled as he worked through the legal language. The castle sat on the northern cliffs, 2 days' ride from Greenhollow. It had been abandoned for the better part of 2 decades, ever since Sir Roderick's death without direct heir. The crown had been content to let it stand empty rather than deal with the complex web of inheritance law. But now that a legitimate heir had been found, the property would transfer according to ancient custom. "It says here," Cornelius had muttered, adjusting his spectacles, that the castle suffered significant damage in a fire some 15 years past. The document mentions structural instability and warns that extensive repairs would be required before habitation. But Aldric had barely heard the warnings. He owned a castle. Whatever its condition, whatever its history, it was his by law and blood. For a man who had spent his adult life balanced on the knife's edge between one world and another, the simple fact of ownership felt like finding solid ground. The news had spread through Greenhollow with the speed that only truly surprising gossip could achieve. By evening, every person in the village knew that the Rust Knight had inherited a ruin. The laughter had started in the taverns and spread from there, growing louder and more creative with each telling. Fitting, old Henrik had declared over his ale, that the poorest knight in the realm should get the most worthless castle. The sentiment had been echoed and embellished throughout the night, each version slightly crueler than the last. But Aldric had felt something else entirely. As he'd sat alone in his cottage that night, watching the fire burn low in his simple hearth, he'd experienced something he hadn't felt in years. Possibility. Whatever Castle Ravenshollow might be, however ruined or worthless, it was his. For the first time since his knighthood, he had something that wasn't borrowed, granted, or given out of pity. He had a place in the world that belonged to him by right. The morning Aldric set out for Castle Ravenshollow, half the village had found reasons to be out early. They lined the muddy street like spectators at a country festival, some pretending to tend their gardens, others making a show of examining their storefronts. All of them watching as the Rust Knight prepared to claim his inheritance. Martha Goodwin, the cooper's wife, stood with her arms crossed and her expression set in lines of barely contained amusement. "Look at him," she whispered to her neighbor, loud enough for Aldric to hear. "Riding off to his grand castle like he's some great lord." Aldric had spent the dawn hours preparing for the journey, packing his few possessions into saddlebags that had seen better decades. His horse, a patient gelding named Bran, was no Destra from the songs, just a sturdy animal suited to a knight of modest means. But Bran was reliable, and that mattered more than appearance. As he led his horse through the village center, the comments followed him like autumn leaves in the wind. "Wonder if the roof's still on," called out James the miller. "Probably find nothing but rats and ravens' nests," added his brother, but it was young Peter Ashford who delivered the cruelest cut. The merchant's son, barely 20 and already showing the soft roundness that came from a life of easy meals, stepped directly into Aldric's path with the swagger of inherited privilege. "Sir Aldric," Peter said, his voice dripping with mock courtesy, "I hear congratulations are in order. A castle of your very own." The word "sir" came out like something distasteful he needed to spit from his mouth. Aldric stopped, meeting the young man's eyes steadily. "Indeed, the Crown's own chancery has confirmed it." Peter's grin widened. "Oh, I'm sure it's all quite legal. Though I wonder, have you given thought to what you'll do when you arrive at this grand inheritance of yours? I mean, assuming there's anything left standing." He gestured broadly, playing to his audience. "Perhaps you could set up as a hermit. Live off berries and bird eggs. Very noble occupation, that." The laughter that followed was sharp and mean, the kind that sought to wound rather than amuse. Aldric felt the familiar heat rise in his cheeks, the same burning shame that had followed him since childhood. Whenever the distance between his aspirations and his reality became too obvious to ignore. But something else stirred within him as well, something quieter but more substantial. For 3 years, he had endured their skepticism with patience, had proven his worth through small deeds and careful behavior. He had hoped that time would earn him the respect that birth had denied him. Now, watching Peter's performance and hearing the crowd's eager laughter, he understood that no amount of patience would ever be enough. "You may be right about the castle's condition," Aldric said finally, his voice carrying clearly across the small crowd. "But it is mine by law and blood. That makes it more than many can claim." The words were mild, but something in his tone made Peter's grin falter slightly. "Well, yes, I'm sure you're very proud." "I am," Aldric interrupted, and now his voice carried the authority he'd learned on battlefields, where hesitation meant death. "I'm proud to have something that belongs to me alone. Something I don't need to beg for, or earn through others' charity, or accept as a gift from those who pity me." The crowd had grown quieter now, sensing that the entertainment was taking an unexpected turn. Peter's face flushed red, but whether from embarrassment or anger wasn't clear. "Pride comes before a fall, they say," Peter managed. "Perhaps," Aldric replied, swinging up into his saddle with practiced ease. "But a man can't fall from his knees." He rode out of Greenhollow without looking back, but he could feel their eyes on him until the road curved away between the oak trees. The silence he left behind was different from the mocking laughter, heavier, more thoughtful. For the first time in years, he had spoken his mind without weighing every word for possible offense. The journey to Castle Ravenshollow took him through countryside he'd never seen before. The road climbed steadily northward, leaving behind the gentle farmlands around Greenhollow for wilder terrain. Ancient forests pressed close to the track, their shadows deep and cool even in the midday sun. Stone bridges crossed streams that ran quick and clear over moss-covered rocks as the afternoon wore on. Aldric began to understand why this land had remained largely unsettled. The soil was thin and rocky, better suited to sheep than crops. The few cottages he passed looked weathered and worn, their inhabitants giving him cautious nods, but no invitation to linger. This was border country, the kind of place where people minded their own business and expected others to do the same. The road began to climb more steeply as evening approached, winding up through pine forests that filled the air with their sharp, clean scent. Somewhere ahead lay the northern cliffs and his inheritance, but darkness was falling fast. He made camp in a sheltered hollow beside a stream, sharing his simple meal with Bran while the night sounds of the forest settled around. Then sleep came fitfully, broken by dreams of crumbling towers and empty halls. When dawn came gray and misty, Aldric rose with a strange mixture of anticipation and dread. Today he would see Castle Ravenshollow for the first time. Today he would learn what his inheritance truly meant. The final approach was steeper still, the road switching back and forth as it climbed toward the cliff tops. The trees grew smaller and more twisted here, shaped by constant wind from the sea. When the forest finally opened up, Aldric found himself on a high promontory with the northern ocean stretching away like hammered steel under the cloudy sky. And there, perched on the cliff's edge like a wounded bird, stood Castle Ravenshollow. The villagers' mockery suddenly seemed less cruel and more prophetic. The castle was indeed a ruin, not the romantic kind beloved by poets, but the harsh reality of stone and timber yielding to time and flame. The main keep still stood, but its roof was gone, leaving jagged walls open to the sky. Two of the three towers had partially collapsed, their stones scattered across the courtyard like broken teeth. Ivy and bramble had claimed much of the outer walls, and what remained of the wooden structures, gates, walkways, outbuildings, showed the distinctive blackening of old fire damage. Yet as Aldric rode closer, studying the ruin with the practical eye his father had taught him, he began to see possibilities the villagers had missed. The foundations were massive and sound, built from the gray granite of the cliffs themselves. The walls that remained standing were thick and solid, designed to withstand both siege and storm. The damage was extensive, certainly, but not beyond repair for someone willing to work with stone and timber. More importantly, the castle's position was magnificent. It commanded a view of the sea that stretched to the horizon, while the landward approach could be seen for miles across the rolling countryside. In its prime, this had been a fortress of genuine strategic value. Even in ruin, it possessed a dignity that spoke of noble purpose. The great gate hung askew on rusted hinges, but it still bore the carved arms of House Ravenshollow, a raven in flight above three holly branches. Aldric dismounted and pushed through into the courtyard, his footsteps echoing strangely in the open space. The silence was profound, broken only by the wind through the broken stones and the distant crash of waves against the cliffs below. Yet, it wasn't the oppressive silence of death or abandonment. It felt more like waiting, as if the castle had been holding its breath for years, preparing for someone to return and wake it from its slumber. Standing there in the courtyard of his ruined inheritance, surrounded by the evidence of dreams long since reduced to ash and rubble, Aldric made a decision that would change everything. He would not sell the castle, would not trade it for some modest sum and return to his uncertain position in Greenhollow. He would rebuild it. Stone by stone, timber by timber, he would restore Castle Ravenshollow to something approaching its former glory. It was an impossible task for a knight with empty pockets and no connections. It would take years, perhaps decades. It might well consume the rest of his life without ever reaching completion. But it was his impossible task, his castle, his choice. For the first time since he'd been knighted on a muddy battlefield, Sir Aldric Thornfield felt like he truly belonged somewhere. The first night in Castle Ravenshollow tested every assumption Aldric had ever made about comfort. He'd expected to sleep rough, had done so many times as a knight-errant, but he hadn't anticipated the way sound carried through the broken walls, or how the wind off the sea could find every gap in stone and mortar. By morning, he was stiff, cold, and nursing doubts that felt as sharp as the ocean air. But doubt was a luxury he couldn't afford. He'd burned his bridges in Greenhollow as surely as fire had consumed his castle's roof. There would be no graceful retreat, no quiet return to his cottage with its intact walls and reliable hearth. This pile of broken stone was his future now, for better or worse. The daylight revealed details that shadows had hidden. In what had once been the great hall, Aldric found the remains of a massive oak table, its surface charred but still solid. The fireplace was intact, its chimney drawing well despite the missing roof. Most encouraging of all, the castle's well in the courtyard still held sweet water, its stone-lined shaft disappearing into darkness but yielding clear, cold liquid when he lowered a bucket. He spent that first week simply exploring, mapping the extent of damage and cataloging what remained usable. The kitchen retained 3 of its 4 walls and most of its stone ovens. The stables, built into the cliff face itself, had survived almost untouched. There were storage chambers carved directly from the living rock, their arched ceilings intact, and their contents protected from weather. It was in one of these chambers that Aldric made his first significant discovery, not the fortune that would later change everything, but something more immediately practical. Behind stacks of moldering grain sacks, hidden beneath a canvas tarp that crumbled at his touch, he found tools. Not just any tools, but the specialized implements of castle construction. Massive stone lifting devices, iron wedges for quarrying, levels and measuring chains, everything needed to work with blocks of granite weighing hundreds of pounds. The metal showed rust but remained fundamentally sound. Here was equipment worth more than everything he'd owned in Greenhollow, abandoned by whoever had fled the fire years ago. With tools came possibility, and with possibility came the first stirrings of a plan. Aldric had grown up in a smithy, had learned to work metal and stone from childhood. These weren't noble skills in the traditional sense, but they were practical ones. If he could clear the rubble, repair the basic structures, make the castle habitable again, well, that would be achievement enough. But as he worked through those first days, hauling stones and clearing debris, Aldric began to realize that he wasn't entirely alone. Someone was watching him. The signs were subtle at first. A recently used fire ring in the woods below the castle. Footprints in the mud near the stream that fed into the ocean. The sense, common to anyone who'd spent time in wild places, of being observed by eyes he couldn't see. On his 5th day at Ravenshollow, the watcher revealed himself. Aldric was working in the courtyard, using a lever to shift a fallen block back into position, when a voice spoke from behind him. "You're doing it wrong." He spun around, hand moving instinctively toward his sword, to find himself facing an elderly man who seemed to have materialized from the very stones. The stranger was tall and lean, with a wild mane of white hair and clothes that looked like they'd been patched from every material available. But his eyes were sharp and intelligent, and he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone entirely at home in these ruins. "I'm sorry?" Aldric managed. "The stone," the old man said. nodding toward the block Aldric had been struggling with. "You're trying to force it back where it fell from, but that's not where it belongs. See how? The mortar's different on that end. It came from higher up the wall." Aldric looked more closely and realized the stranger was right. The weathering patterns on the stone did indeed suggest it had come from a different position entirely. "You know this castle well," he said carefully. The old man smiled, revealing teeth that were surprisingly good for his apparent age. "I should. I've been its caretaker for the past 12 years. Name's Garrett. Garrett Wickham, though most folk just call me Old Garrett." "Caretaker?" Aldric tried to reconcile this with the official documents that had made no mention of any permanent residence. "Unofficial-like," Garrett admitted with a shrug. "When Sir Roderick died and the family scattered, someone needed to keep watch. Make sure treasure hunters and bandits didn't strip the place bare. The crown never appointed anyone official, so I appointed myself." This explained the feeling of being watched, and also the fire ring in the woods. "You've been living here all this time? Here and about?" "I know every stone of this place, every passage and chamber. Built myself a comfortable enough shelter in the lower levels where the weather can't reach." Garrett studied Aldric with those sharp eyes. "Question is, what are you planning to do about it?" It was a fair question, and one that cut to the heart of the matter. Legally, Aldric owned the castle and everything in it. He could order Garrett to leave, could claim exclusive right to the property. But looking at the old man, seeing the deep knowledge and obvious affection he bore for these ruins, such an action felt both churlish and wasteful. "I'm planning to rebuild," Aldric said finally. "Not all at once, but piece by piece. Make it livable again." Garrett's weathered face creased into what might have been approval. "Good. She's been waiting long enough." He gestured toward the broken walls around them. "Castle like this has life in her still. Just needs someone with sense enough to tend it properly." "She? All castles are she," Garrett said matter-of-factly. "Ships too, and storms and anything else worth respecting. Now, you want to know how to really move that stone, or are you planning to spend all day wrestling with it?" What followed was Aldric's first real education in the ancient craft of castle building. Garrett proved to be a master of the old techniques, the methods that had raised these walls in the first place. Under his guidance, Aldric learned to read the stones themselves, to understand how they wanted to fit together, to work with their weight rather than against it. "Every stone has its proper place," Garrett explained as they maneuvered the wayward block into its correct position. "Forcing them where they don't belong just makes more work later." The old builders knew this. They'd study a wall for hours before placing a single stone. "How do you know so much about building?" Aldric asked as they paused to rest. Garrett's smile turned mysterious. "Oh, I've had plenty of time to learn. 12 years of nothing but these walls and the wind for company. A man studies what's in front of him after a while." He paused, seeming to weigh his words. Besides, Sir Roderick kept extensive records. Plans, correspondence, even some of the original building notes from when the castle was first raised, all tucked away safe where the fire couldn't reach them. This was news that made Aldric's pulse quicken. Original building plans would be invaluable for reconstruction, worth more than all the specialized tools he'd found. "Where are these records?" "Safe," Garrett repeated, and his tone suggested that was all he planned to say on the matter for now. "First thing is to make you a proper place to sleep. Can't have the lord of the castle bedding down in the courtyard like a common vagrant." The work that followed was unlike anything Aldric had experienced. It combined the physical demands of his father's smithy with the precision required of knightly combat, all guided by principles he was only beginning to understand. Garrett proved to be a demanding teacher, patient with honest mistakes, but sharp-tongued when carelessness threatened their progress. Together, they cleared one of the smaller chambers in the keep's base, repairing its roof with salvaged timbers and making it weatherproof. They built a proper fireplace, connecting it to an existing chimney that drew well. They even constructed simple furniture from stones and wooden planks, creating a space that was comfortable, if not luxurious, as they worked. Garrett shared stories of the castle's past, not the grand histories found in books, but the human details that brought the stones to life. He told of Sir Roderick's struggles to maintain the fortress on a modest income, of the servants who had loved the place despite its isolation, of the fire that had destroyed a decade of careful repairs in a single night. What caused the fire? Aldric asked one evening as they sat beside their own carefully tended blaze. Garrett's face grew somber. Lightning strike on a summer storm. Hit the main tower, spread faster than anyone could fight it. Sir Roderick tried to save the records, nearly died in the attempt. That's when his health broke, really. Never recovered from the smoke he breathed that night. The old man stared into the flames for a long moment before continuing. He'd planned to rebuild, Had architects come up from the capital, drew up new plans, even started gathering materials. But the costs? Garrett shook his head. Castle this size, it takes resources most knights don't have. When Sir Roderick died, the plans died with him. Until now, Aldric said quietly. Until now, Garrett agreed. Though I hope you understand. What you're taking on, this isn't just stone and timber. It's generations of dreams, all waiting for someone strong enough to make them real. 3 weeks into his residence at Castle Ravenshollow, Aldric began to understand why his great-uncle had loved this place enough to die trying to save it. Each morning brought new discoveries, small revelations that slowly painted a picture of what the castle had been in its prime in the ruins of what Garrett called the solar, the Lord's private chambers. Aldric found fragments of stained glass that caught the morning light like scattered jewels. The windows themselves were long gone, but the careful arrangement of the colored pieces suggested they had once depicted scenes of remarkable beauty. Working by touch and intuition, he began sorting the fragments by color and pattern, imagining how they might someday be reassembled. Sir Roderick commissioned those from a craftsman in the capital. Garrett explained when he found Aldric carefully wrapping the glass pieces in cloth. Cost him nearly a year's income, but he said a proper castle needed proper windows. Light was important to him, hated dark, closed spaces. The comment sparked something in Aldric's memory. The fire. You said he died trying to save records. What records were so important he'd risk his life for them? Garrett was quiet for so long that Aldric wondered if he'd overstepped some boundary. When the old man finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. Family. Papers mostly. Correspondence with other houses. Documents proving his claims to certain lands, that sort of thing. But there were other items too. Things that went back to the castle's founding, back to the old king's time. He met Aldric's eyes directly. Things that certain people might find very interesting indeed. What kind of things? The kind, Dad. Make men rich, Garrett said simply. Or dead, depending on how they handle them. Before Aldric could press for more details, they were interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Multiple riders, moving at a pace that suggested purpose rather than casual travel. Garrett's expression immediately grew wary. Expecting visitors? He asked. Aldric shook his head, moving toward the courtyard entrance. Through the broken gates, he could see a small party of mounted men cresting the final rise below the castle. 6 riders in well-maintained gear, led by a figure whose bearing spoke of authority and wealth. Lord Garrett's son, Garrett muttered, recognizing the lead rider. Young Marcus. Haven't seen him around these parts for better than 5 years. The name meant nothing to Aldric, but Garrett's tone suggested this was not necessarily a welcome development. They watched as the party approached the gates, the horses' hooves ringing against the stone bridge that spanned the narrow ravine protecting the castle's landward approach. Lord Marcus Garrett proved to be a man in his early 40s. well-dressed, but not ostentatiously so, with the kind of practical elegance that came from real wealth rather than pretension. His companions were clearly men-at-arms, professional soldiers who sat their horses with easy competence. When he spoke, his voice carried the educated accent of the capital. "Good morning," he called out as he rode into the courtyard. "I'm looking for Sir Aldric Thornfield. Would that be you?" "It would," Aldric replied, stepping forward. "How may I serve you, my lord?" Marcus dismounted with fluid grace, handing his reins to one of his men. "Marcus Garrett, at your service. I hold land some 20 miles south of here. I've come about your inheritance." The formality of the introduction didn't escape Aldric's notice. This wasn't a social call or a welcoming visit from a neighbor. This was business. "I wasn't aware my inheritance was a matter of concern to others," Aldric said carefully. Marcus smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, everything that happens in these parts is of concern to me, Sir Aldric. I've held responsibility for keeping the peace along the northern border for the better part of 15 years. When a new landowner takes possession of property this significant, it's natural that I should want to make his acquaintance." "Significant?" Aldric gestured around at the obvious ruins. "As you can see, there's not much here to concern anyone." "Ah, but that's where you might be mistaken." Marcus began walking slowly around the courtyard, his eyes taking in details with the practiced assessment of someone who understood fortification. "Castle Ravenshollow may be damaged, but its position remains strategically valuable. The approaches from the sea, the view of the main road in the right hands, this could still be a formidable stronghold." There was something in the way he said, "the right hands," that put Aldric on guard. "I have no intention of troubling anyone. I'm simply trying to make the place habitable." Of course. Marcus paused beside the well, peering down into its depths. "Though I wonder if you've fully considered the costs involved in such an undertaking. Castle restoration is expensive work, requiring specialized craftsmen and materials. For a knight of forgive me modest means, it might prove overwhelming." The subtle insult hung in the air between them. Aldric felt his jaw tighten, but kept his voice level. "I appreciate your concern, but I believe I can manage." "I'm sure you believe that." Marcus straightened, brushing dust from his hands. "Which is why I've come with a proposal that might interest you. I've been looking to expand my holdings in this region, and Castle Ravenshollow, even in its current condition, would suit my purposes admirably. I'm prepared to offer you a generous sum for the property, enough to purchase a comfortable estate elsewhere, perhaps closer to civilization." Now the true purpose of the visit became clear. This wasn't neighborly concern. It was an attempt to buy him out before he could establish himself properly. "The castle is not for sale." Marcus's smile remained fixed, but something shifted behind his eyes. "Perhaps you should consider the offer before declining. 1,500 gold marks is more than most knights see in a lifetime." It was indeed a substantial sum, more money than Aldric had ever possessed. But something in Marcus's eagerness to acquire the property set off warning bells. Why would anyone pay so much for a ruin unless they knew something about its value that wasn't obvious? "I said the castle is not for sale," Aldric repeated firmly. "Everything is for sale at the right price," Marcus replied, his tone growing cooler. 2,000 marks, final offer. "My lord, I appreciate your interest, but I have no intention of selling. This is my home now." For a moment, Marcus's mask of courtesy slipped entirely, revealing something much less pleasant underneath. Then he mastered himself, the smile returning though it looked forced now. "Very well, but you should understand that rebuilding this place will attract attention, not all of it welcome. These are dangerous times, Sir Aldric. Bandits operate in these hills, and there are political currents at work that you may not fully appreciate. A man alone with limited resources, and no local connections, might find himself vulnerable to forces beyond his control. The words could have been interpreted as concern or warning, but Aldric heard the threat clearly enough. "I'm not alone," he said, glancing toward where old Garrett stood in the shadows of the keep. "And I'm not defenseless." Marcus followed his gaze, noticing Garrett for the first time. His expression darkened further. "Ah, yes. The hermit who's been living in these ruins. I'd heard rumors." He raised his voice slightly. "You there, old man? What's your business here?" "I live here," Garrett replied simply, stepping into the sunlight. "Have for years." "Not anymore, you don't," Marcus said sharply. "This property has a new owner now, and I doubt he has use for squatters and vagrants." The casual cruelty of the dismissal sparked anger in Aldric's chest. "Actually, Master Garrett has proven invaluable in helping me understand the castle's needs. He'll be staying as long as he wishes." Marcus stared at him for a long moment, clearly reassessing. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of genuine puzzlement. "You're making a mistake, Sir Aldric, a serious one. I'm offering you a chance to walk away from this with your dignity and your purse intact. Pride is a luxury you can't afford." "Perhaps," Aldric replied, "but it's mine to afford or not." The tension in the courtyard was thick enough to cut. Marcus's men-at-arms sat motionless on their horses, hands resting casually near their weapons while their eyes tracked every movement. For a moment, it seemed as though the situation might turn violent. Then Marcus stepped back, his diplomatic mask sliding back into place. "I see I've misjudged you, Sir Aldric. You're more stubborn than I anticipated." He moved toward his horse, then paused. "But stubbornness isn't always a virtue. Sometimes it's simply another word for foolishness." He mounted with the same fluid grace he'd shown dismounting, gathering his reins with practiced ease. "I'll leave you to your restoration project, but my offer stands should you come to your senses. 2,000 marks, available anytime you realize you're in over your head." The party rode out as purposefully as they'd arrived, leaving behind only the echo of hoofbeats and an atmosphere of unresolved tension. Aldric watched them disappear over the ridge before turning to Garrett. "What was that really about?" he asked. Garrett was quiet for a long moment, studying the gate where Marcus had vanished. "Power," he said finally, "and fear. That young lord knows something about this place that he doesn't want you to discover." "What kind of something?" "The kind that makes offering 2,000 gold marks seem like a reasonable investment," Garrett replied grimly. "We need to talk, Sir Aldric. There are things about Castle Ravenshollow that you need to know, things that Sir Roderick died protecting." That evening, as storm clouds gathered over the northern sea and rain began to drumbeat against the stones of Castle Ravenshollow, Garrett finally led Aldric to the records he'd spoken of so mysteriously. They descended through a narrow passage behind the kitchen, down stone steps that had been carved directly from the cliff face. The air grew cooler as they went deeper, carrying the mineral smell of deep stone and the distant sound of waves crashing far below. Sir Roderick had this chamber prepared specifically for storage, Garrett explained as they reached the bottom of the stairs. Waterproof, fireproof, and hidden from casual discovery. Took him 3 years to have it carved out properly. The chamber they entered was larger than Aldric had expected, its arched ceiling supported by pillars of living rock. Oil lamps in wall niches provided flickering light that danced across stone surfaces worn smooth by years of careful tending. But it was the chamber's contents that took Aldric's breath away. Wooden shelves lined every wall, filled with scrolls, bound volumes, and document cases. Tables in the center of the room held maps spread flat under sheets of oilcloth. Chests of various sizes occupied the corners, their contents carefully catalogued by labels written in a precise hand. "Mother of God," Aldric whispered. Sir Roderick was a scholar as much as a knight. Garrett said proudly. Collected everything he could find about this region's history, going back to the founding of the kingdom. Some of these documents are originals charters signed by the old king himself, correspondence between great houses, records of battles and alliances that shaped the realm. Aldric moved to the nearest shelf, studying the careful organization. Everything was arranged by date and subject, with notations in what must have been Sir Roderick's own hand. This is a fortune in historical documents. Aye, but that's not what young Lord Marcus is after, Garrett said grimly. Come here, let me show you something. He led Aldric to a table where a large map lay spread beneath protective cloth. When Garrett lifted the covering, Aldric found himself looking at a detailed survey of the coastal region, marked with notations in multiple hands and different colored inks. This was made during the old king's time, Garrett explained, pointing to a date inscribed in the corner. See these marks here? His finger traced a series of symbols along the coastline. Caves, natural harbors, landing points that could be used to bring cargo ashore without passing through official ports. The implications began to dawn on Aldric. Smuggling routes. More than that, Garrett said. During the war with the southern kingdoms, King Edmund used these routes to move gold and supplies. But when the war ended, the routes didn't disappear. They were just used for different purposes. He moved to another section of the map where additional symbols marked locations inland. Safe houses, storage points, places where valuable cargo could be hidden until it was safe to move. Aldric studied the map more carefully, noting how many of the marked locations were within the territory that would have been controlled by Castle Ravenshollow. Sir Roderick was involved in this smuggling network? His grandfather was certainly. During the war, House Ravenshollow served as coordinator for the entire northern operation. They knew every cave, every secret path, every hiding place from here to the capital. Garrett's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. And they kept detailed records of everything. But that was generations ago. Surely, look at this, Garrett interrupted, pulling out a leather portfolio from beneath the map. Inside were documents in much more recent hand, dated within the past 20 years. Sir Roderick discovered that some of the old network was still active. Different purposes now: private smuggling, tax avoidance, moving goods that certain people preferred to keep hidden from royal oversight. Aldric scanned the documents, his comprehension growing with each page. Names of merchants, dates of shipments, quantities, and values of various cargoes. It was a complete intelligence picture of illegal activity spanning decades. Sir Roderick was documenting ongoing crimes? He was trying to decide what to do about them, Garrett explained. Some of these operations involved people he'd known all his life: neighbors, fellow nobles, merchants who traded honestly for years but found the profits of smuggling too tempting to resist. He couldn't simply turn them over to the crown without destroying entire families. But there was more. As Aldric continued reading, he found references to something called the repository, a central storage point, where the most valuable items from the smuggling network were kept. The location was never stated directly, but the references made clear it was somewhere within Castle Ravenshollow itself. Garrett, Aldric said slowly, what exactly is hidden in this castle? The old man was quiet for a long time, staring at the documents spread before them. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of years of kept secrets. Gold, to start with. Coins from a dozen kingdoms, all stored away during the war and never claimed. Gems that were payment for information or passage. Silver plate from houses that fell during the fighting. Art treasures that were moved north for safekeeping and then forgotten when their owners died. He moved to one of the chests in the corner, producing a key from somewhere in his robes. But the real treasure isn't gold or silver. It's this. The chest opened to reveal more documents, but these were different from the others. These were sealed with ribbons and wax, marked with the personal sigils of great houses, bearing the stamps of royal authority. Promissory notes, Garrett explained. Debts of honor from the war years. Agreements to pay certain sums when the kingdom was secure. Guarantees of land grants, titles, privileges, all signed by King Edmund himself. Aldric's hands trembled slightly as he lifted one of the documents. The wax seal bore the royal arms, and the signature at the bottom was unmistakably that of the old king. The sum mentioned made his head spin. These are still valid? Under royal law, debts of the crown never expire unless formally forgiven. And King Edmund never had the chance to settle these before he died. Garrett's smile was grim. His son honored some of them, but others were conveniently forgotten. The current king probably doesn't even know they exist. The magnitude of what he was seeing began to sink in. These documents represented claims against the crown itself, obligations that, if pressed legally, could bankrupt noble houses or elevate commoners to positions of power and wealth beyond imagining. How much? Aldric asked quietly. All told, the golden goods are worth perhaps 50,000 marks. Considerable wealth, but not extraordinary for a great house. Garrett paused, meeting Aldric's eyes directly. But the promissory notes, if even half of them were honored, would be worth more than 200,000 marks. 200,000 marks. More wealth than most kingdoms possessed. Enough to reshape the balance of power across the realm. And it was all hidden somewhere within the walls of Castle Ravenshollow, waiting for someone with the knowledge and courage to claim it. Lord Marcus knows about this, Aldric said. It wasn't a question. He suspects. Sir Roderick was careful, but not careful enough. Before he died, he made inquiries about the legal status of some of these claims. Those inquiries reached certain ears, and people began asking questions. That's why Marcus wants to buy the castle. That's why he wants to buy it, and why he'll do whatever necessary to get it if you won't sell, Garrett confirmed grimly. 2,000 marks is nothing compared to what's really at stake here. Aldric sank into a chair beside the table, overwhelmed by the enormity of what he'd inherited. He'd thought he was getting a ruined castle and a chance to rebuild his life. Instead, he'd inherited a secret that could change the fate of kingdoms and put his own life in mortal danger. What would you do? He asked Garrett. The old man considered the question carefully. Sir Roderick spent years trying to answer that same question. He died before he could decide. He gestured around the chamber filled with centuries of accumulated secrets. Now the choice is yours. But whatever you decide, you'd better decide quickly. Lord Marcus isn't the only one who's heard rumors about Castle Ravenshollow's secrets. The weight of the secret pressed down on Aldric like a physical thing as he spent the following days studying the documents in Sir Roderick's hidden chamber. Each scroll and ledger revealed new layers of complexity, new connections between past and present that made his head spin with the implications. The repository that the documents referenced was not merely a storage room. It was an entire network of connected chambers carved deep into the cliff beneath the castle. According to the maps, it could be accessed through several concealed entrances. The main one, hidden behind what appeared to be a solid wall in the castle's lower cellars. Sir Roderick's grandfather was thorough, Garrett explained as they studied the architectural drawings by lamplight. He understood that gold and documents needed different kinds of protection. The gold required security from thieves, but the documents needed protection from time itself, moisture, fire, decay. The plan showed chambers lined with lid to prevent dampness, with air shafts that carried fresh air from the surface while remaining invisible from outside. There were even escape routes that led to sea caves below the castle, allowing someone to flee by boat if the land approaches were compromised. Have you ever seen any of this yourself? Aldric asked. Garrett shook his head. Sir Roderick showed me these plans, but he never took me down there. Said it was safer if only one person knew the exact location of everything. After he died in the fire, I looked for the entrance he'd described, but he shrugged helplessly. The descriptions in his notes aren't clear enough. I could spend years searching and never find the right spot. That night, Aldric dreamed of vast chambers filled with gold, of documents that could topple kingdoms, of shadows moving through passages carved from living stone. He woke before dawn with the absolute certainty that someone was watching the castle. The feeling proved accurate. From his window in the keep, he could see the glint of reflected sunlight from the ridge to the south, someone with a spyglass or polished metal mirror, keeping the castle under observation. When he pointed it out to Garrett, the old man's expression grew troubled. "Lord Marcus is getting impatient," Garrett said. "3 days since his visit, and you're still here working on repairs. He probably expected you to give up and sell by now." "Let him watch," Aldric replied grimly. "I'm not going anywhere," but the surveillance was only the beginning. Over the next week, a series of small incidents made it clear that pressure was being applied from multiple directions. A merchant from whom Aldric had ordered building supplies sent word that the materials were no longer available. The blacksmith in the nearest village, who had agreed to forge replacement hardware for the castle's gates, suddenly found himself too busy to take on new work. More concerning were the strangers who began appearing in the area. Travelers who asked too many questions about the castle and its new owner. Men who claimed to be merchants, but whose hands bore the calluses of swordwork rather than trade. Garrett spotted several of them observing the castle from concealed positions in the woods. Professional work, he observed after tracking one group to their camp. Not bandits or casual opportunists. These men are being paid well for their time. The message was clear: surrender the castle voluntarily, or face consequences that would make voluntary surrender seem preferable. Aldric's response was to accelerate his repairs. Working from dawn to dusk, he and Garrett focused on making the castle defensible rather than comfortable. They cleared rubble from the walls, repaired the mechanisms that operated the main gate, and identified positions that could serve as strong points if the castle came under siege. It was during this work that they made an unexpected discovery. While clearing debris from what had been a storage room, Aldric's shovel struck something that rang like a bell. Brushing away dirt and ash, he uncovered a section of floor that was clearly different from the rest-fitted stones that formed a perfect rectangle with a ring of iron set into one corner. "A trapdoor," Garrett breathed, kneeling beside the discovery. "This isn't on any of the plans I've seen." Working together, they managed to lift a heavy stone slab, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. The air that rose from below was cool and dry, carrying a faint scent of cedar and old parchment. "This has to be it," Aldric said, his voice tight with excitement and apprehension. "The entrance to the repository." They descended carefully, Garrett carrying a lamp while Aldric kept one hand on his sword hilt. The stairs were carved from solid rock, worn smooth by years of use, but clearly built to last centuries. After 20 steps, they reached a landing where the passage branched in 3 directions. The walls here bore marks that made Aldric's breath catch the raven and holly arms of House Ravenshollow, carved deep into the stone and filled with what appeared to be silver. But these weren't simple decorations. Each carving was positioned above a particular passage, and the silver inlay formed patterns that corresponded to symbols on Sir Roderick's maps. Navigation markers, Garrett realized. Each passage leads to a different section of the repository. They chose the central passage, following it as it curved gently downward. The walls here were lined with fitted stones, and the floor was paved with slate that had been carefully leveled. This wasn't crude tunneling. It was engineering on par with the greatest castles in the kingdom. The passage opened into a chamber that took their breath away. It was perhaps 30 feet long and half as wide, with an arched ceiling that disappeared into shadows above their lamp's reach. But it was the chamber's contents that made Aldric stagger. Wooden chests lined the walls in neat rows, each one bound with iron and secured with heavy locks. Shelves built into the stone held objects wrapped in oilcloth shapes that suggested plate armor, weapons, works of art. In the center of the chamber, a massive oak table held document cases made of the finest leather, their surfaces unmarked by time or moisture. "Sweet Mother of God," Aldric whispered. Garrett approached one of the chests, running his fingers over the ironwork. "The locks are all intact. No one's been down here since Sir Roderick died." They opened the nearest chest, and even by the flickering light of their lamp, the contents were dazzling. Gold coins from kingdoms across the known world, their surfaces gleaming as if they'd been minted yesterday. Silver pieces bearing the faces of kings dead for generations. Gems that caught the light and threw it back in colors that had no names. The second chest held more of the same, but also items of even greater value. A crown that had once belonged to a southern prince. A sword whose blade was inscribed with runes of power. A set of goblets made from what appeared to be unicorn horn. But it was the document cases that represented the true treasure. Opening the first one, Aldric found himself holding papers that could reshape the kingdom's entire political structure. Promissory notes signed by the old king. Grants of land that had never been claimed. Pardons for crimes that could still destroy. Noble houses if revealed. One document in particular caught his attention. A royal decree granting the bearer the right to claim any unclaimed lands within a day's ride of Castle Ravenshollow. Signed by King Edmund and sealed with the royal seal. The parchment was pristine, the ink still dark, the seal unbroken. "This could make me one of the greatest landowners in the northern kingdom," Aldric said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Or it could get you killed," Garrett replied pragmatically. "Power like this always comes with a price." They spent hours cataloging what they could see, barely scratching the surface of the repository's contents. There were other chambers. The passages they hadn't explored led to spaces that seemed even larger than the first. The wealth hidden beneath Castle Ravenshollow was beyond calculation, but so was the danger it represented. As they finally climbed back to the surface, both men carried the weight of impossible choices. The secret they now shared could elevate Aldric to heights of power and wealth beyond his wildest dreams, but it could also destroy him utterly. Every person who learned of the repository's existence would become either an ally or an enemy, and, in either case, they would represent a threat to his life and freedom. Standing in the ruined courtyard as dawn broke over the northern sea, Aldric made a decision that would change everything. The repository would remain secret for now, but he would not hide from those who sought to take it from him. If Lord Marcus and his allies wanted a fight, they would get one, but it would be a fight on Aldric's terms, not theirs. The castle needed more than repairs now. It needed to become a fortress in truth, strong enough to withstand siege and defendable by a small force against much larger numbers. And Aldric needed allies, people who could be trusted with secrets that kingdoms had died to protect. The game had changed, and Aldric Thornfield intended to win it. The revelation came not from any document in the repository, but from a conversation overheard by pure chance. Aldric was working on the castle's outer wall, repairing stones loosened by wind and rain, when he heard voices carrying on the sea breeze from the direction of the old harbor below the cliffs. The natural acoustics of the cliff face acted like a speaking tube, carrying sounds from the small cove where ships had once landed to supply the castle. Aldric had discovered this phenomenon days earlier, but the harbor had been empty then. Now, it seemed, someone was using it for a clandestine meeting. Motioning for Garrett to remain silent, Aldric crept to the edge of the cliff where the ancient winch mechanism had once lifted supplies from boats below. Lying flat on his stomach behind a screen of wind-twisted shrubs, he could see 2 small boats moored in the protected cove. Perhaps a dozen men stood on the narrow beach, their voices echoing off the rock walls. One of the voices belonged to Lord Marcus. The other was unfamiliar, but carried the educated tones of the capital. "Patience is wearing thin," the stranger was saying. His Majesty expected this matter to be resolved weeks ago. Every day that passes increases the risk of exposure. I've made generous offers," Marcus replied defensively. "The knight is more stubborn than anticipated. But there are other methods, which should have been employed from the beginning," the stranger interrupted. "This isn't some minor border dispute, Marcus. If those documents surface, they could destabilize the crown itself. Do you understand the implications of what you're saying when you tell me one landless knight is proving difficult to handle?" Aldric's blood ran cold. These weren't merely local nobles seeking to enrich themselves. This conspiracy reached all the way to the throne itself. "Perhaps if I understood exactly what we're looking for," Marcus said carefully, "I could approach the problem more effectively. The old records mention a repository. But you don't need to understand anything beyond your role," the stranger snapped. "Find the documents, destroy them, eliminate anyone who might have seen them. These are not complex instructions. And the knight? Whatever happens to Sir Aldric Thornfield is entirely up to him. If he cooperates, he might live to see his next birthday. If not," the shrug was audible in the man's voice, "there are many dangers associated with castle restoration. Accidents happen." Marcus's response was lost in the sound of waves against the rocks, but his tone suggested discomfort with the discussion's direction. The stranger, however, pressed on relentlessly. "The promissory notes signed during the war years represent obligations the crown cannot honor without bankrupting the kingdom. King Edmund was generous with his promises when he needed support, but he never intended for all of them to be claimed simultaneously. His son has worked for 20 years to ensure that most of those documents remain lost. And if they surface now, then loyal houses that supported the crown during the war will demand payment for their sacrifice. Merchants will claim compensation for goods never paid for. Mercenary companies will present bills for wages never settled." The stranger's voice grew grimmer. The current king would face a choice between national bankruptcy or repudiating his father's word. Either choice would destroy the monarchy. Understanding crashed over Aldric like a cold wave. This wasn't about personal enrichment or local politics. The documents in the repository represented a fundamental threat to the stability of the kingdom itself. King Edmund's wartime promises had been so generous that honoring them all would be impossible, which meant that the current king had a compelling interest in ensuring they never came to light. "There's something else," Marcus said hesitantly. "Intelligence suggests that other parties may have learned about the repository. House Blackwater has been asking questions about Sir Roderick's death. Lord Brennan has sent agents to make inquiries in the northern ports. All the more reason to move quickly," the stranger replied. "Every day we delay gives our enemies more time to position themselves. I want this matter concluded within the week, Marcus. Use whatever methods necessary." The meeting began to break up, with men climbing back into their boats and preparing to depart. Aldric remained hidden until both vessels had disappeared around the point, their wake the only evidence they had ever been there. When he finally made his way back to the castle, Garrett took one look at his face and knew something momentous had occurred. "What is it?" the old man asked. "We're not dealing with local politics," Aldric said grimly. "This goes all the way to the crown. The king himself wants those documents destroyed." He recounted what he'd overheard, watching Garrett's expression grow more troubled with each detail. When he finished, the old man was quiet for a long time. "It makes sense," Garrett said finally. "Sir Roderick once told me that King Edmund had been too generous with his promises during the war. He said the old king had signed obligations that would cripple the kingdom if they were ever all presented at once. Which means we're not just fighting Lord Marcus and his mercenaries, Aldric realized. We're fighting the crown itself. Or serving it, Garrett said thoughtfully. Think about this from another angle. You now possess documents that could destroy the kingdom's financial stability. That makes you either a threat to be eliminated or an asset to be secured. The distinction was crucial, and it opened possibilities that hadn't existed before. If Aldric could find a way to approach the king directly, to demonstrate that he wasn't seeking to exploit the situation for personal gain, perhaps an accommodation could be reached. But there's another problem, Garrett continued. You heard Marcus mention other houses showing interest in the repository. House Blackwater, Lord Brennan, these aren't minor nobles. They're major players in the kingdom's politics. House Blackwater controlled much of the kingdom's southern coastline and maintained the largest private fleet in the realm. Lord Brennan held extensive lands in the east and commanded significant military resources. If they were moving to acquire the repository's contents, it suggested a much larger political game was in motion. They want to use the documents against the crown, Aldric said, understanding flooding through him. Force the king to honor the promissory notes, bankrupt the royal treasury, then position themselves as the power behind a weakened throne. Or replace the king entirely, Garrett agreed grimly. A monarch who can't pay his father's debts appears weak. Weak kings don't stay kings for long. The true magnitude of his inheritance was finally clear. Castle Ravenshollow wasn't just a ruined fortress hiding ancient treasure. It was the key to a struggle that would determine the kingdom's future. The documents in the repository weren't merely valuable. They were weapons of political warfare, capable of toppling dynasties or elevating new ones, and Aldric held them all. Standing in the courtyard of his crumbling castle, watching storm clouds gather over the northern sea, he realized that his choice was no longer between wealth and safety, between anonymity and recognition. His choice was between serving as a pawn in other people's games, or becoming a player in his own right. The boy who had grown up in his father's smithy, learning to work iron and steel, now held the tools to reshape a kingdom. But like any tools, they could build something magnificent or destroy everything he touched. What would Sir Roderick have done? He asked Garrett. The old man considered the question carefully. He would have chosen the path that served the kingdom's best interests, even if it cost him personally. Sir Roderick was many things, but above all, he was loyal to the realm itself, not necessarily to any particular king, but to the idea of the kingdom as something worth preserving. And what serves the kingdom's interests now? That, Garrett said quietly, is what you need to figure out. And you need to figure it out quickly, because Lord Marcus isn't going to wait much longer before he tries more direct methods of persuasion. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the approach road. But this wasn't the measured pace of Lord Marcus's previous visit. This was the urgent rhythm of riders moving at speed, carrying news that couldn't wait. Aldric moved to the gate, Garrett beside him, as a single horseman crested the rise and galloped toward the castle. The rider's cloak bore no identifying marks, but his horse was lathered with sweat, and his posture spoke of exhaustion and desperation. "Sir Aldric," the man called as he approached. "Sir Aldric Thornfield." "I am here," Aldric replied, stepping forward. The rider nearly fell from his saddle in his haste to dismount. He was young, perhaps 20, with the soft hands and pale complexion of someone more accustomed to books than swords. "My name is Thomas Ashford," he gasped, still catching his breath. "I serve Lord Brennan of Eastmark. My lord has sent me to warn you, Lord Marcus is moving against the castle tonight. They mean to take it by force and kill anyone they find inside." The young messenger's words hung in the air like a death sentence. Thomas Ashford swayed on his feet, clearly exhausted, from hard riding, but his eyes burned with urgency that couldn't be ignored. "When?" Aldric asked, his voice deadly calm. "Tonight, after moonset, when the darkness is deepest. Lord Marcus has gathered 40 men professional soldiers, not local levies. They plan to scale the cliffs from the sea approach while a second force attacks the main gate." Garrett cursed under his breath. 40 men. That's more than enough to take this place, especially with the walls in their current condition. Aldric studied the messenger's face, searching for deception or ulterior motive. Why would Lord Brennan warn me? According to what I overheard, today he's interested in the repository himself. Thomas straightened, some of his composure returning. My lord believes in choosing his battles wisely. If Lord Marcus takes the castle by force and destroys everything within it, no one benefits except the crown. Lord Brennan prefers negotiation to unnecessary bloodshed. What kind of negotiation? Safe passage for you and your companion in exchange for access to Sir Roderick's records. My lord is prepared to offer substantial compensation for your cooperation, enough to purchase estates far from here, where you could live comfortably without fear of royal retribution. It was a more generous offer than Lord Marcus had made, but it amounted to the same thing: surrender the castle and its secrets to forces beyond his control. And if I refuse? Aldric asked. Thomas glanced nervously toward the approaching dusk. Then you'll face Lord Marcus's assault alone. My lord's forces are positioned to intervene if you accept his offer, but they won't risk themselves in a hopeless fight. How do I know this isn't a trap? That you're not working with Marcus to flush me out? Because, Thomas said, reaching into his saddlebags, Lord Brennan sent me with this. He produced a leather tube sealed with wax and ribbons. The seal bore the arms of House Brennan, but more importantly, it also bore a second seal, one that made Aldric's breath catch. The royal arms, Garrett whispered. Thomas nodded grimly. Lord Brennan has been in correspondence with His Majesty about this matter. The king is not entirely pleased with Lord Marcus's handling of the situation. There are those at court who believe a more subtle approach might yield better results. Aldric broke the seals and unrolled the document within. It was written in the formal language of the royal chancery, but its meaning was clear enough. King Aldwin Edmund's son and current ruler hereby commanded that any materials related to the wartime promissory notes be handled with utmost discretion, and that Sir Aldric Thornfield be given opportunity to present himself at court before any final decisions were made regarding his inheritance. Thought it wasn't exactly a royal pardon, but it was recognition that the king preferred negotiation to the violent solution Lord Marcus was preparing to implement. This changes things, Aldric said, showing the document to Garrett. Does it? The old man replied skeptically. The king wants the documents destroyed just as much as before. He's simply offering you a chance to do it voluntarily rather than dying for them. Perhaps. But it also means there's a faction at court that opposes Marcus's methods. That gives us options we didn't have before. Thomas shifted impatiently. Sir Aldric, I must have an answer. Lord Marcus's men are already moving into position. If Lord Brennan is to act, it must be soon. The choice crystallized in Aldric's mind. With startling clarity, he could accept Lord Brennan's offer, trade his discovery for safety and wealth, and spend the rest of his life wondering what might have been. Or he could make a stand here, in the castle that was truly his, and face whatever consequences followed. Tell Lord Brennan I appreciate his offer, Aldric said finally. But Castle Ravenshollow is my home, and I don't abandon my home to threats. Thomas stared at him in disbelief. You're choosing to fight 40 professional soldiers with? He looked around the ruined courtyard. With what? You're one man in a broken castle. 2 men, Garrett corrected quietly. And the castle isn't as broken as it appears. This is madness, Thomas protested. You can't possibly win. Maybe not, Aldric agreed. But I can make the cost high enough that others will think twice before trying the same approach. Thomas remounted his horse, shaking his head. Lord Bren will not be pleased. He was hoping to resolve this matter without bloodshed. Then perhaps he should speak to Lord Marcus about calling off his attack, Aldric suggested. You don't understand. The force is at work here, Thomas said desperately. This isn't just about local politics anymore. There are powers in the capital who want this matter concluded, regardless of the cost. If Marcus fails tonight, they'll send someone else, and then someone else after that. You can't fight the crown forever. I'm not fighting the crown, Aldric replied. I'm fighting men who would use the crown's authority for their own purposes. There's a difference. Thomas gave up, spurring his horse toward the gate. I'll tell Lord Brennan you refused his offer. What happens next is on your own head. As the messenger disappeared over the ridge, Garrett turned to Aldric with a mixture of admiration and exasperation. You realize you've just declared war on half the kingdom's nobility? I've declared that I won't be driven from my own home. By threats and bribes, Aldric corrected. What they choose to make of that is their decision. The sun was setting now, painting the western sky in shades of red and gold that seemed ominous given the circumstances. They had perhaps 4 hours. Before Marcus's assault began 4 hours to prepare for a siege, they had little hope of surviving. What do we have to work with? Aldric asked, his mind already shifting to practical considerations. Garrett's smile was grim but determined. More than our enemies know. Come, let me show you some of Sir Roderick's other preparations. They descended into the castle's lower levels, past the hidden entrance to the repository, into chambers that Aldric had barely explored. Here, Garrett revealed the true extent of the defensive preparations that had been made over the decades. Sir Roderick wasn't just a scholar. Garrett explained as he showed Aldric caches of weapons and armor hidden throughout the castle. He was a knight who understood that knowledge without the means to defend it was worthless. He prepared for the possibility that someday someone would come for what he protected. There were crossbows of the finest craftsmanship, their steel prods still spring-steel tight after years of storage. Arrows in the hundreds, their points sharp and true. Swords and daggers wrapped in oilcloth, their edges still keen. But most importantly, there were devices that Aldric had never seen before, mechanical contraptions that looked like siege engines built in miniature. Trap bows, Garrett explained, showing Aldric how the devices worked. Position them in narrow passages. Set the triggers, and they'll loose their bolts at anyone who passes without knowing the safe path. Sir Roderick designed them himself, based on mechanisms he'd seen in the Eastern Kingdoms. There were other surprises as well. Sections of flooring that could be made to collapse, dropping attackers into pits lined with spikes. Hidden reservoirs of oil that could be ignited to turn stairways into furnaces. Even a mechanism that could seal the main gate so thoroughly that it would take hours to break through, even with proper siege equipment. The castle may look ruined, Garrett said with satisfaction, but Sir Roderick made sure it could still bite anyone who tried to take it by force. They worked through the night, setting traps and preparing defenses with the methodical precision of men who understood that their lives depended on getting every detail right. Aldric found himself drawing on knowledge he'd never known he possessed, lessons his father had taught him about metalwork translated into deadly applications, understanding of leverage and force that could turn simple mechanisms into instruments of war. As they worked, Garrett shared more of the castle's secrets, hidden passages that connected the main keep to the outer walls, allowing defenders to move unseen between positions. Spy holes that permitted observation of approaching enemies while remaining invisible from outside. Even a secret signal system that could summon help from allies if any existed. Sir Roderick maintained correspondence with several knights who shared his values. Garrett explained as they tested the castle's ancient bell system. Men who believed that loyalty to the realm meant more than blind obedience to whoever wore the crown. Some of them might still answer a call for aid. Will there be time to summon them? Not for tonight's fight, but if we survive until morning, word will spread. Lord Marcus is taking a significant risk by attacking a knight on his own lands without royal warrant. There will be those who disapprove of his methods, regardless of their opinion of his goals. As midnight approached, they took positions in the keep's upper chamber, where arrow slits provided commanding views of both the main approach and the cliff paths that led up from the sea. Aldric wore Sir Roderick's armor, which fit him well enough, and carried the finest sword from the castle's hidden armory. Garrett, despite his age, moved with the fluid competence of a man who had faced combat before. "One thing I need to know," Aldric said as they waited in the darkness. "Who are you really? You know too much about warfare, about castle defense, about the politics of this situation to be just a caretaker." Garrett was quiet for a long moment, studying the moonlit approaches to the castle. When he finally spoke, his voice carried weight of long-held secrets. "I was Sir Roderick's squire many years ago. Fought beside him in the border wars, served him when he was young and eager for glory. When age caught up with me and my sword arm grew slow, he offered me a position as castellan. I accepted, thinking it would be a quiet retirement." He gestured toward the documents and treasures hidden below them. "Instead, I became keeper of the kingdom's most dangerous secrets, guardian of knowledge that could reshape the realm or destroy it entirely. And now? Now I'm an old man preparing to fight his last battle alongside the rightful heir to Castle Ravenshollow." Garrett's smile was fierce in the moonlight. There are worse ways to end a story. A flicker of movement on the main road caught Aldric's attention, then another and another. Lord Marcus's forces were approaching, moving with the practiced stealth of professional soldiers. The assault on Castle Ravenshollow was about to begin. The attack came with the methodical precision of men who had done this work many times before. Through the arrow slits, Aldric watched as Lord Marcus's forces split into three groups, one approaching the main gate with scaling ladders and ropes, another moving toward the cliff paths that led up from the sea, and a third positioning themselves to cut off any escape routes. "Professional work," Garrett murmured, his voice barely audible. "These aren't hired thugs. These are soldiers who've served in real wars." The first test of their defenses came at the main gate, where a dozen men attempted to scale the walls using iron hooks and rope ladders. But Sir Roderick's preparations proved their worth immediately. As the first attacker reached the top of the wall, he triggered a mechanism that released a cascade of loose stones, sending him tumbling back to the ground with a cry of pain and surprise. The second wave learned from the first mistake, approaching more cautiously. But caution couldn't protect them from the trap boughs Garrett had positioned along the wall walk. The mechanical devices loosed their bolts with deadly accuracy, dropping two more attackers before the others realized what they faced. "They're pulling back," Aldric observed, watching the assault force retreat beyond effective range. "Regrouping." "Marcus isn't a fool," Garrett replied. "He'll try a different approach now that he knows we're not helpless." The different approach came from the seaside, where the steep cliff paths offered concealment from the castle's main defenses. But Sir Roderick had anticipated this possibility as well. Hidden among the rocks along the climbing route were more trap boughs, their triggers set to activate when climbers reached specific points. The screams that echoed up from the cliff face told Aldric that the sea assault was meeting similar difficulties. But there were many more attackers than defenders, and even the best prepared defenses could only delay the inevitable for so long. "They're learning our tricks," Garrett said grimly as the sounds of combat grew closer. "Marcus will keep testing until he finds a weakness." The weakness, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. While Aldric and Garrett focused on the dramatic assaults at gate and cliff, a small group of attackers had found the old postern gate, a narrow entrance that had been blocked with rubble but not completely sealed. Working quietly while there, comrades created distractions elsewhere. They managed to clear enough debris to squeeze through. The first sign of their success was the sound of steel on steel from the courtyard below. Aldric spun toward the stairs leading down from the keep, but Garrett caught his arm. "Wait," the old man said urgently. "Let them come up. The stairway is narrow. They can only approach one at a time." It was sound tactical thinking, but emotionally devastating to hear enemies moving freely through the castle that was supposed to be their sanctuary. Heavy footsteps echoed from the stone stairs, accompanied by the scrape of weapons against walls and the harsh breathing of men preparing for close combat. The first attacker to reach the upper chamber was a compact man with scarred hands and the fluid movements of a professional killer. He paused at the doorway, studying the defensive positions Aldric and Garrett had prepared, then smiled with grim appreciation. "Sir Aldric Thornfield, I presume," he said conversationally. "My name is Captain Willem Voss. Lord Marcus has authorized me to offer you one final opportunity to surrender." "The terms?" Aldric asked, not lowering his sword. "Your immediate departure from the castle, forfeiture of all claims to the property, and your sworn oath never to speak of anything you may have discovered here." Voss paused, studying Aldric's face. "In exchange, you and your companion will be permitted to leave alive, and if I refuse, then my men will take the castle by force, and we'll search it at our leisure. The outcome will be the same, but the process will be considerably more unpleasant for everyone involved." Aldric glanced at Garrett, seeing his own determination reflected in the old man's eyes. They had come too far, risked too much to surrender now. "I refuse," Aldric said simply. Captain Voss nodded as if he'd expected no other answer. "Very well. I tried to be reasonable." He raised his voice, calling down the stairs. "Bring them up, all of them." The sound of ascending footsteps multiplied, becoming a steady drumbeat of approaching violence. Aldric counted at least 8 separate sets of feet, possibly more, against 2 defenders in a single chamber. Those were overwhelming odds. But as the first wave of attackers appeared in the doorway, Aldric discovered that desperation could transform him into something he'd never been before. The sword in his hands, Sir Roderick's blade, forged by a master craftsman and maintained with loving care, moved with deadly precision. The armor he wore turned aside blows that should have been fatal, while his own strikes found gaps in his opponent's defenses with uncanny accuracy. Beside him, Garrett fought with the economical movements of a man who had learned to conserve energy while maximizing effect. His blade never wasted motion, never committed to attacks that left him vulnerable, never failed to punish carelessness in his opponents. The narrow doorway that had seemed like such a disadvantage proved to be their salvation. Only 2 attackers could enter simultaneously, and the confined space made it impossible for them to use their superior numbers effectively. Bodies began to pile up in the entrance, creating obstacles that further hampered subsequent waves of assault. But even the best defensive position couldn't hold forever against determined attack. Aldric felt his strength beginning to ebb as wound after small wound accumulated. Garrett, despite his skill, was breathing hard and moving more slowly with each exchange. Captain Voss, directing the assault from the rear, was clearly content to let his men wear down the defenders through sheer attrition. It was then that the unexpected happened, the sound of horns echoing across the night, coming from the direction of the main road. Not the crude instruments used by bandits or local levies, but the clear, ringing notes of trained military musicians. Captain Voss cursed, pushing forward through his own men to peer out one of the arrow slits. What he saw there made his face go pale. "Cavalry," he announced grimly. At least 2 squadrons, moving fast. Lord Brennan? One of his men asked. No, those banners. Voss strained to see more clearly in the darkness. Those are royal standards, the king's own guard. The implications struck everyone in the chamber simultaneously. If the royal guard was approaching, it meant the king himself was taking direct interest in the situation. Lord Marcus's private. War was about to become a very public affair, with consequences that could extend far beyond a single castle on the northern cliffs. Orders, Captain? One of the attackers asked. Voss hesitated, clearly torn between completing his mission and avoiding a confrontation with royal authority. The sound of approaching hoofbeats was growing louder, accompanied now by the rattle of equipment and the voices of men preparing for action. Withdraw, he decided finally. Fall back to the boats. We'll complete this another time. As quickly as they had appeared, the attackers melted away, leaving Aldric and Garrett alone in the blood-stained chamber. Through the arrow slits, they could see torches moving down the cliff paths as Lord Marcus's forces retreated toward their waiting vessels. But the approaching cavalry was real enough, and as dawn began to break over the northern sea, Aldric could see the distinctive surcoats and banners of the king's guard cresting the final rise before the castle. The king's guard approached Castle Ravenshollow with the measured discipline of elite troops, their formation perfect despite the difficult terrain. At their head rode a figure that made Aldric's breath catch, not the king himself, but someone whose presence was almost as significant. Sir Edmund Blackwood, the king's champion, was a legend among knights throughout the realm. Tall and broad-shouldered, with silver hair that caught the morning light and scars that spoke of countless battles won, he carried himself with the easy authority of a man who had never questioned his place in the world. Behind him rode 2 full squadrons of the royal cavalry, their armor gleaming and their weapons ready. These weren't ceremonial guards playing at war. They were hardened veterans who had fought in the kingdom's most desperate battles and emerged victorious. As the column reached the castle gates, Sir Edmund raised his hand, and the entire force came to a halt with military precision. His voice, when he spoke, carried clearly across the courtyard. Sir Aldric Thornfield, by order of His Majesty King Aldwin, you are commanded to present yourself for royal audience. Aldric descended from the keep, Garrett beside him, both still wearing the armor and carrying the weapons they had used to defend the castle. Blood stained their clothes and weariness showed in their movements, but they walked with the dignity of men who had faced overwhelming odds and survived. I am Sir Aldric Thornfield, Aldric announced as he approached the gates. This is my companion, Master Garrett Wickham. We are at your service, Sir Edmund. The king's champion studied them, both with eyes that missed nothing. You've seen combat recently, he observed. Lord Marcus's work, I presume. Lord Marcus attempted to take the castle by force during the night, Aldric confirmed. We defended ourselves as honor required, and Lord Marcus withdrew when your approach was reported. His men departed by boat, heading south along the coast. Sir, Edmund nodded grimly. We observed the boats from the ridge. Lord Marcus will answer for this night's work, but that matter can wait. His Majesty has more pressing concerns. He dismounted, handing his reins to an aide, and approached the gates. Sir Aldric, the king has received disturbing reports about discoveries made within this castle. Reports that suggest materials of significant political sensitivity may have been found. There was no point in denying what was already known. Discoveries have been made, Aldric admitted carefully. Materials left by the previous owner, Sir Roderick Ravenshollow, documents dating from the war years, promissory notes and obligations signed by the late King Edmund. Among other things, yes. Sir Edmund was quiet for a moment, studying the ruined castle with the practiced eye of a military engineer. His Majesty wishes to examine these materials personally. You are commanded to accompany me to the capital, where you will present everything you have found to the royal court. It wasn't a request, and Aldric recognized the futility of resistance. Even if he could somehow defeat 2 squadrons of the King's Guard, which was impossible, doing so would make him an enemy of the crown itself. "I understand," he said. "When do we depart?" "Within the hour. Pack only what you need for travel, your personal effects, nothing more." Sir Edmund's tone softened slightly. "Sir Aldric, I want you to understand that His Majesty is not necessarily hostile to your situation. But the documents you've discovered represent potential threats to the kingdom's stability. They must be examined by those qualified to determine their authenticity and legal significance. And after that examination, that depends on what is found and on your cooperation during the process." Sir Edmund glanced around the courtyard, taking note of the signs of recent battle. "The fact that you chose to defend your inheritance rather than flee suggests character. The king appreciates loyalty, even when it's inconvenient." As Aldric and Garrett prepared for the journey to the capital, word arrived that changed everything. Once again, a messenger riding a lathered horse approached the castle at full gallop, bearing dispatches marked with the urgent seals of the royal chancery. Sir Edmund read the messages with growing concern, his expression darkening with each document. When he finished, he looked up at Aldric with something approaching respect. "It seems your situation has become even more complicated," he said grimly. "Lord Brennan has petitioned the king for exclusive rights to examine the Ravenshollow documents, claiming they may contain evidence of treasonous activity by other noble houses. Meanwhile, House Blackwater has filed a formal challenge to your inheritance, arguing that the marriage connection through which you claim ownership was never legally validated." "What does that mean?" Aldric asked. "It means that half the kingdoms, great houses are now interested in what you found here. Your little castle has become the center of a political storm that could reshape the balance of power throughout the realm." A new voice spoke from behind them, cold, cultured, and completely unexpected, which is exactly what we hoped would happen. Everyone spun toward the source of the voice, hands moving instinctively toward weapons. Standing in the gateway to the inner courtyard was a figure none of them had heard approach, a woman in dark traveling clothes, her face hidden by a hood, but her bearing unmistakably noble. Sir Edmund's hand was on his sword hilt in an instant. "Who are you? How did you get past my sentries?" The woman lowered her hood, revealing features that made Sir Edmund curse under his breath. She was perhaps 30 years old, with the distinctive auburn hair and green eyes of House Ravenshollow. But more significantly, she wore at her throat a pendant bearing the personal arms of the royal family. "Lady Catherine Ravenshollow," she announced formally. "Daughter of Sir Roderick, heir to Castle Ravenshollow, and by royal appointment, special investigator for the crown." The silence that followed was profound. Garrett staggered as if he'd been struck, staring at the woman with obvious recognition and something approaching terror. "Catherine?" he whispered. "But you died in the fire. Sir Roderick saw you die." "Sir Roderick saw what he was meant to see," she replied calmly. "My death was exaggerated for political necessity. I've spent the past 15 years serving the crown in various capacities, most of them involving situations where official royal involvement would be inconvenient." Sir Edmund found his voice first. "My lady, I had no knowledge of your involvement in this matter. My orders came directly from His Majesty, whose orders I helped draft," Lady Catherine interrupted smoothly. "The king needed someone he could trust to evaluate the true significance of the repository's contents, someone with intimate knowledge of their history and political implications." She turned to Aldric, studying him with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "You've done well, Sir Aldric. Better than we expected when we arranged for you to inherit the castle." "Arranged?" Aldric felt the ground shifting beneath his feet once again. "Did you truly believe it was coincidence that you, of all people, were discovered to be Sir Roderick's heir?" The genealogical connection is real, but it took considerable effort to trace and document. We needed someone with the right combination of honor, competence, and desperation to serve our purposes. What purposes? Lady Catherine's smile was sharp as a blade. To flush out every noble house and political faction that has been scheming. To acquire the repository's contents. Lord Marcus, Lord Brennan, House Blackwater, they've all revealed themselves by their actions regarding your inheritance. Now we know exactly who can and cannot be trusted when the kingdom's stability is at stake. The magnitude of the deception crashed over Aldric like a cold wave. He had been a pawn all along, manipulated by forces he had never even suspected existed. His inheritance, his struggles, his near death in defending the castle, all of it had been orchestrated by others for their own purposes. But even as anger and betrayal surged through him, another realization struck. If Lady Catherine was truly Sir Roderick's daughter and the legal heir to Castle Ravenshollow, then his own claim was invalid. Everything he had fought for, everything he had risked his life to defend, belonged to someone else. The great hall of the royal palace had been transformed for the occasion. Banners representing every major house in the kingdom hung from the vaulted ceiling, while representatives of those houses sat in carefully arranged rows that reflected decades of political maneuvering and ancient alliances. At the far end of the hall, on a throne that had been carved from a single block of black marble, sat King Aldwin himself. Aldric stood before the throne in borrowed court dress, still struggling to comprehend how thoroughly his life had been manipulated by forces beyond his understanding. Beside him, Lady Catherine Ravenshollow wore the formal robes of her office as special investigator, while Sir Edmund Blackwood maintained his position as the king's right hand. The past month had been a whirlwind of revelations, investigations, and political maneuvering that had shaken the kingdom to its foundations. The repository's contents had been catalogued, verified, and evaluated by teams of scholars, legal experts, and royal clerks. The results had exceeded even Lady Catherine's expectations. The promissory notes alone, King Aldwin announced to the assembled court, represent obligations totaling more than 300,000 gold marks. If honored in full, they would bankrupt the royal treasury and destabilize the kingdom's entire financial structure. A murmur ran through the hall. Not surprise, exactly, but a kind of grim acknowledgement that everyone's worst fears had been confirmed. However, the king continued, investigation has revealed that many of these obligations were signed under circumstances that make their legal validity questionable. Others duplicate payments that were made through different channels during the post-war reconstruction. Still others represent promises made to individuals or organizations that no longer exist. Lady Catherine stepped forward, carrying a leather portfolio that contained months of painstaking research. Your Majesty, of the original obligations totaling 300,000 marks, approximately 50,000 represent legitimate, unpaid debts. The remainder can be legally dismissed on various grounds, and the legitimate debts can be settled over a period of years without significant strain on the royal treasury. We recommend a structured payment plan that honors the crown's obligations, while maintaining fiscal stability. It was a masterful solution, one to preserve the monarchy's honor while avoiding financial catastrophe. But Aldric knew it was only part of the story. What of the conspiracy to acquire these documents through illegal means? He asked, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. King Aldwin's expression darkened. Lord Marcus Garrett has been stripped of his titles and lands. His attempt to assault Castle Ravenshollow without royal warrant constitutes treason, and he will face trial accordingly. Several of his associates have also been arrested on charges ranging from conspiracy to attempted murder, and Lord Brennan, House Blackwater, have been cautioned that their overeager interest in these matters has been noted. the king replied dryly. They will find their influence at court somewhat diminished for the foreseeable future, but the political consequences significant. As they were, paled beside the personal resolution that followed. King Aldwin rose from his throne, descending the steps to stand directly before Aldric. Sir Aldric Thornfield, he said formally, you have served the crown with distinction, despite being unaware that you were doing so. Your courage in defending Castle Ravenshollow, your refusal to be intimidated or bought, and your ultimate cooperation in resolving this matter have earned our gratitude. Your Majesty, Aldric replied, bowing deeply, I seek no reward beyond the knowledge that I have served honorably. Nevertheless, rewards there shall be. The king gestured to Lady Catherine, who approached carrying a sealed document. By royal decree, we confirm your inheritance of Castle Ravenshollow and grant you additional land sufficient to support the restoration of that fortress to its former glory. Furthermore, we appoint you Royal Warden of the Northern Marshes, with responsibility for maintaining peace and security along our border with the sea. The appointment came with a substantial annual income, resources for rebuilding the castle, and most importantly, the king's personal protection against future political maneuvering. Additionally, Lady Catherine said, speaking for the first time since the formal proceedings began, I hereby deed to you my personal claim to Castle Ravenshollow, acknowledging that you have proven yourself more worthy of the inheritance than blood alone could make you. It was a gesture that few in the hall fully understood, but Aldric grasped its significance immediately. Lady Catherine was choosing to legitimize his claim not through legal maneuvering, but through personal recognition of his character and actions. My lady, he said quietly, such generosity is more than I deserve. On the contrary, she replied, it's exactly what you've earned. The formal ceremony concluded with oaths of loyalty and service, but the real resolution came later in a private meeting between Aldric, Lady Catherine, Garrett, and Sir Edmund. They gathered in a small chamber overlooking the palace gardens, where afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows, and the sounds of the city seemed distant and peaceful. There's one thing I still don't understand, Aldric said, as they settled into comfortable chairs. Why me? You could have arranged for anyone to inherit the castle, someone with better connections, more resources, greater political sophistication. Lady Catherine smiled, and for the first time since revealing herself, she looked genuinely warm rather than calculating. Because we needed someone who would do the right thing regardless of personal cost. Someone whose honor couldn't be bought or intimidated. In all our investigation of possible candidates, you were the only one who met those criteria. You investigated me? Extensively. Your service record, your reputation in Greenhollow, your response to various challenges and setbacks, we knew exactly what kind of man you were before we arranged for your inheritance. Garrett, who had been unusually quiet during the court proceedings, finally found his voice. What about the future? The castle is yours now, truly yours, but it's still a ruin. Rebuilding will take years, perhaps decades. Then we'd better start. Soon, Aldric replied with a smile. I don't suppose you'd be interested in remaining as castellan. Officially this time? An old man like me? I'm not sure I'm up to the challenge. An old man who helped hold Castle Ravenshollow against 40 professional soldiers? I think you're exactly what the position requires. Sir Edmund leaned forward, his expression serious. Sir Aldric, you should understand that accepting the king's appointment makes you a permanent target for certain factions at court. There will always be those who believe the repository's secrets should have been handled differently, or who resent the influence your position gives you. I understand, but running from responsibility has never solved anything. If Castle Ravenshollow is to serve the kingdom's interests, it needs someone willing to defend those interests regardless of personal risk. Lady Catherine nodded approvingly. Spoken like a true knight. My father would have approved of you, I think. As the meeting drew to a close and they prepared to return to the north, Aldric reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought him from village outcast to royal appointee. He had gained wealth, position, and security beyond his wildest dreams, but more importantly, he had gained something he'd sought all his life, a place where he truly belonged. The sun was setting as they rode out of the capital, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to promise better days ahead. Castle Ravenshollow waited for them on its cliff-top perch, no longer a ruin to be mocked, but a symbol of service, honor, and the power of doing what was right regardless of the cost. Behind them, the great game of politics would continue, with new players and new schemes replacing those that had been exposed and defeated. But ahead lay the simpler, more honest work of rebuilding something beautiful from the ashes of the past, stone by stone, choice by choice, day by day. For Sir Aldric Thornfield, the Rust Knight no more. It was exactly the life he had always wanted but never dared to hope he could achieve. And as Castle Ravenshollow came into view against the darkening sky, its broken walls silhouetted against the stars, he knew that he was finally truly home.